So, yeah, my title is Circles of Servitude, Social Criticism and Contemplative Cinema in Parque and Workers. In a chapter of a recent book titled Realism of the Senses, A Tendency in Contemporary World Cinema, Thiago Gianluca quotes André Bazin on the existence of several realisms, emphasizing that, I quote, each period looks for its own technique and the aesthetics that will capture, retain, and render best that one wants from reality. I'll quote. Gianluca analyzes films made by Béla Tarr, Carlos Reigadas, Tsai-Ming Liang, and Gus Van Sant, among others, and argues for, I quote, a sensory mode of address as their distinctive feature. This means for Gianluca that other than using devices traditionally associated with cinematic realism, such as location shooting, non-professional actors, deep focus cinematography, and the long take, these films offer, I quote, a contemplative viewing experience anchored in materiality and duration. Gianluca's inspiring approach developed in his text could potentially reconcile the various descriptions and terminologies used in academic and critical discourses with reference to more or less the same group of films, which otherwise then being called contemplative cinema. I came across the terms slow cinema and cinema of boredom. In this presentation, I will somewhat do the contrary. And rather than looking for common viewpoints, I will try to distinguish how this sensory kind of aesthetics can be embedded in local context and resonate with concrete socio-political issues. I will illustrate my claims with two less discussed films, both made in Mexico, Enrique Rivero's Parque, made in 2009, and José Luis Valle's Workers of 2013. One of the most important aspects of Gianluca's contemplative cinema is being, I quote, on the frontier between storytelling and sheer recording, where it is no longer clear if time serves the purposes of the narrative or the pure presence experienced in the frame starts to work against it. Here, Gianluca revisits Gilles Deleuze's concept of the time image and states that when Deleuze evokes in the mid-80s, I quote, pure optical and sound situations in which the character does not know how to respond, he is in fact prophesying a cinema, I quote, which would take a few years to fully materialize. For him, for Deleuze, the time image cinema requires a new type of character that no longer acts in perpetual motion and according to a causal logic, as was the case in classical cinema. This is a point that most studies on the cinema of Carlos Reigadas, the link I would like to apply towards my main concern here, come across. Writing on Reigadas' Japón, Robert Eford uses almost the same words. I quote, here with the rise of pure optical and sound situations, these characters largely cease to act within the story and instead take on much more of an observational role. In another text, Johann Hirschfeld recalls Kovács's Jungian term of the abstract individual, I quote, whose past and inner drives are not determining factors of what happens to him, and who exists physically in that he can be seen, yet his existence is disconnected from any conventional linear narrative logic. Furthermore, Craig Applin argues that in Japón, the human, I quote, the human is not prioritized, but rather is treated the same as an object or a non-human animal. In other words, these authors refer to Reigadas' characters as mere presences with no past and no future, abstractions whose main role is to perceive images and sounds. At the same time, while this will lead Eford and Hirschfeld to conclude that the core of Reigadas' work consists of universal modernist values, Applin focuses on national concerns. He argues that despite the apparently apolitical narratives repeatedly reinforced as such in interviews with the director, Reigadas does intervene in the political context of the Mexican and global present. What's more, it is at the level of the form of his films that this is manifest. In Iplin's interpretation, Mexico's turn to neoliberal capitalism over the past few decades is reflected in Japon's cinematic language. This, in part, can be seen in that human object and non-human animal are equally at the center or equally outside the camera's attention, what tells us that, I quote, all of these have become in today's economy commodities. It is a similar logic that will now lead me to connect contemplative aesthetics with social and political criticism in my examples. What I will try to demonstrate is how Parque Villa and workers turn their sensory mode of address into a less pure observation and incorporate viewer experience of time and space in their political agenda in advancing legal rights and equality for domestic workers in Mexico. The plot of Parque Villa centers on Beto, a housekeeper who lives alone in a luxury villa that is for sale, and he works on the conservation of the real estate. Throughout the film, the character barely leaves the house, rather he goes on with his work in total monotony. I will show you a brief sequence just to imagine how it is shot. As the dialogue reveals, he has been doing so for 30 years. However, this daily routine is disturbed in the second half of the film when a buyer finally appears. This brief summary already suggests that time has a special role in Parque Villa. Here it is more the cyclical construction of the narrative than the long takes that create a sense of hypnotic present in which both the protagonist and the viewer lose control over time. Beto's work is to guarantee permanence, making sure that nothing changes in the environment. What's more, although he has several sets of clothes, all are of the same kind, as we have seen white shirts and black trousers. This practically makes the character look fully identical at all times throughout the movie. As he performs the same activities with only small variations, he rarely contacts other people, and these contacts are transformed into important plot points and markers of time. In one specific episode, children dressed as monsters ring the bell and ask for sweets, and here the viewer's reaction may be the same as Beto's. He says, "I didn't know that it's already Halloween." The sense of time in José Luis Valles' workers is highly similar. This film follows two plot lines. The protagonist of the first one is Rafael, illegal immigrant from El Salvador, who has been working as a cleaner for a transnational company for 30 years also. Although he is not a household worker, his stories and activities may repeatedly remind us of Parque Villa. And in the second plotline, Lydia and other maids, gardeners, chauffeurs, and bodyguards serve in a huge luxury villa. In contrast with Parque that took its scenery and protagonists from a real house in Mexico City, Workers combines realistic sensory effects with kind of satirical artificiality. I will show you a brief example, and excuse me for the ruined aspect ratio. The plot of Workers, we are told, is evolving during 10 years. However, the spectator cannot keep track with the passing of time in this case either, given that the narration consists of slow episodes of repetitive actions. Sometimes the film uses the same type of shots and the characters do the same task with the exact same movements. Other than that, ellipses in the narrative cannot be properly interpreted due to a lack of change in the environment. We can only tell that Raphael's hair is turning gray over these years. The story's main events that the illiterate Raphael learns to read and write and finally can retire, while Lydia and the other domestic workers inherit the wealth of their employer, are either slow processes or actions satirically turned into prolonged contemplations by the plot's twisted logic. I will summarize this twisted logic. In Workers, it's the owner's pet dog, Princess, that first inherits the luxury estate and the money. The lady's testament declares that only in case of a natural death of Princess, the dog, the wealth will go to the workers. Hence, the workers must slowly make the well-treated dog's health deteriorate by changing its dietary and exposing it to stress, waking it up at random times, and putting on folk songs instead of classical music on their regular drives around the city. As the image's unduly symmetrical compositions also suggest, this is a precisely and carefully designed system of inequality that can only be undermined by tenacious erosion and slow erosion. So the characters are only permitted to perform insignificantly small actions as forms of resistance. This leads us to the motives of disproportion and disorientation in the films. Parque Villa's first shot shows Beto standing at the gate of the house when he suddenly realizes that it's going to rain. So we follow him in an uninterrupted shot as he goes up to the roof to prevent his identical shirts from getting wet, and this takes him no less than 3 minutes. The passage through the labyrinth-like corridors of the house shows the contrast between the gigantic unused halls and Beto's small room, which is incomparably modest in size and in style. Rivero goes on creating a sense of disproportion by stressing differences in scale, as in the scene that follows. Here, the simple task of drinking some water requires the use of different pots belonging to the various scales and different stages of proximity within the depth of the image. Similarly, in the first shot of workers set in the city of Tijuana, we see a mother and her child dwarfed by the gigantic wall between the United States and Mexico as they receive a gift from the US side in a scene that unfolds in a 4 minutes long pan and leads us to the protagonist, offering a range of shifts in the sense of proportion. Thus, Rivero and Valle create contemplative viewing experiences. However, instead of pure optical and sound situations, they offer almost unperceivable narrative changes by showing the character's constant activity and the partly or completely absent result of this work. More than that, by observing grandiose spaces, minimal movement, emotionless acting of non-professional actors, and the passing of several years' time that is marked in dialogue but not experienced in materiality, we experience a stressed sense of distorted or disproportionate time and space. The protagonists can be seen as abstract individuals in their psychological or biographical construction. However, instead of merely being present and observing, they happen to be working nonstop, even when only strolling in giant houses or falling asleep in front of the television. So how does this imply a specific case for us, and why would I refer to Parque Villa and the workers' strategy as concrete social criticism? In Mexico, as Ileana Moreno Ramirez, Sandra Chavez Castillo, and Marilyn Thompson state in their papers, household labor is widely considered a natural part of the family sphere. Therefore, it has almost no social recognition and very vague legal background. As the saying puts it, this work is only seen when not done. Household workers are mostly people who migrate from less developed regions towards bigger cities. Consequently, they are isolated and unaware of their rights, of the existence of local domestic workers' organizations. The vast majority of the more than 2 million Mexican domestic workers never had a contract, hence their working conditions and coordinates are uncontrollable. More than that, they cannot join the social security system and do not have the right to pension. As it can be read in the report of the National Council to Prevent Discrimination, domestic workers suffer exploitation and social negligence on a daily basis. In their case, differences between private and public sphere dissolve, and times and spaces are not clarified nor specifically defined. This means like times and spaces of work, obviously. In short, this type of work is invisible both socially and in legislation, and this results in an uncertain sense of working space and time. In the last decade, significant efforts have been made all around the world aiming at regulating the situation of domestic workers. In 2011, the International Labour Organization accepted a convention concerning decent work for domestic workers. Mexico voted in favor. However, the country's ratification of the convention is still pending. In the last couple of years, many civilian protests and campaigns that wish to advance legal rights for domestic workers were organized to draw attention to the issue, to make the case of household workers visible. This is the process that served as the background of production of films like Parque Villa and Workers. So I would conclude to claim that the socio-political potential of these films lie in the use of the sensory type of gestures mentioned above in order to make the sense of domestic work felt instead of or apart from explained. These films, at a certain level, disorient everyday perception in everyday situations by treating time and space as out of scale, fluid, or disproportionate. In doing so, they take on the most important claims of the struggle for legal rights, namely well-defined times and spaces. More than that, these films construct telling metaphors that are based on sensory experience. They turn social inequality into a sense of space by losing the viewer in the labyrinth of the luxury villas. And on the other hand, They make the result of household work perceivable through an experience in time, a time during which years fly unnoticed, yet the surface is hypnotically still, given that the work consists of maintaining the same conditions. In this way, these films raise the awareness of the circles of servitude, the well-constructed trap of the eternal present of unlegislated and misperceived work. Thank you for your attention.